Prevention-based tools leave you blind to threats inside your network. By adding network traffic analysis to your SOC, you can find and stop attackers before they make their move. ExtraHop provides complete visibility at enterprise scale. Detect threats 95% faster with machine learning that helps Tier 1 analysts perform like seasoned threat hunters. Visit extrahop.com/securityweekly to learn why the SANS Institute calls ExtraHop fast and amazingly thorough. That's extrahop.com/securityweekly. Networks are becoming increasingly complex and fragmented, and digital transformation and DevOps are driving an explosion in network connectivity changes. With each new network connection, cyber attackers may gain another opening to breach or traverse the network. At Tufin, they've pioneered a policy-based approach to network security management using automation and analytics. As a result, you can make network changes in minutes instead of days, reliably and securely. To learn more about Tufin, the security policy company, go to securityweekly.com/Tufin and sign up for a free evaluation. By the end of 2020, 99% of exploited vulnerabilities will be publicly disclosed and known to IT system admins. The consequences of that fact means the burglar will already be in your house because you left the front door wide open by failing to patch known vulnerabilities. How can you keep the threat actors out? Through cloud-based automation, Automox enables you to slam the door on unpatched OS and third-party vulnerabilities across your entire Windows, Mac, and Linux infrastructure. Take advantage of a free trial with Automox to not only see the vulnerability status of your infrastructure, but do something about it within minutes. Start automating the fundamentals of cyber hygiene at securityweekly.com/Automox. That's securityweekly.com/Automox. Welcome back, everyone, to Enterprise Security Weekly. Lee Neely is still here with us, and we'd like to welcome April Wright. She's now a preventative security specialist at architectsecurity.org. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Welcome, April. Nice to have you.
Thank you. Good to be back.
And a quick announcement, Security Weekly is returning to Las Vegas. Literally, we're taking the show on the road. So if you go to securityweekly.com/booking, you can book a paid interview and or possibly, if there's any slots left, a sponsored slot on either Paul Security Weekly or Enterprise Security Weekly, as we are doing lots of recordings at Black Hat. We've opened up some more spots, too, for individual interviews, so make sure you check it out. Again, we've sold out and opened up some more slots, which is awesome. This segment is based on some experiences I've had recently. In talking with John and Matt a couple of weeks ago, I asked them, I said, I feel like even if we just say enterprise security professionals that listen to the show, how many inherit other people's code? Now, this could be a pretty substantial application, or more than likely you're inheriting someone's scripts for doing something, as to accomplish a lot of tasks today requires code. So a lot of us, I believe, are inheriting someone else's code. Now, I just inherited a pretty large application, about 8,000 lines of Python code, as well as some JavaScript thrown in there for the front end as well. So this is the application that I've designed from the beginning. I've been in and out of the code over the years, but not having a developer all year, I had to kind of put a lot of time into it and really review a lot of other people's code. And at least three developers have had their hands in this code. And so over the past few weeks, I've come up with some tips, basically, that if you're going to inherit someone else's code, these are some things that really helped me, and hopefully it helps you. Now, I'm a hardcore Vim user. I've used Vim since way back in the day. Love the command line and the VI editor experience, right? All that stuff. However, when you're inheriting someone else's code, I bit the bullet. And I've tried out other IDEs in the past. I tried Atom. I tried VS Code. I know, April or Lee, do you have a favorite? Everyone has their favorite, and whatever, that's fine.
I'm a VI person too.
There you go. And again, I still am, right? But and Lee, are you VI person as well?
I'm a VI person. I keep trying to type it at the Windows command prompt.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to work.
Right.
Although I'm going to be trying PyCharm as you recommended.
Yeah.
It sounded really cool. I also recently downloaded Atom, but I don't know that I'll do anything with it.
Yeah.
Rather follow my buddy's recommendation, not blaze completely fresh ground.
You can get Cygwin and install VI.
There you go.
I know. And
well,
yeah.
the thing too is I don't want to encourage folks that are in any stage of programming or software engineering, right, to just go to the fancy GUI IDE thing. Like, I truly believe when you first start learning how to program, especially, that you should do it in just a regular text editor with no assistance. Debug your own code, right? Allow it to let you, it allows you to make mistakes, and do that because it's a good learning experience. And then as you progress, I'm really now a really big fan of PyCharm. Actually, our intern Jack, who started officially today, which is awesome, who's already pushing releases into Git, which is great because now I don't have to. It gives me some help, which is great. And the modern IDEs, I think, are really awesome because in the ways that it helped me out looking at other people's code. And now specifically, it does a lot of really cool things that I was like, wow, I haven't used an IDE in a really long time. And getting back into it, I was like, this is great. So the first thing is variable usage. So it tells you if a variable is unused, and it tells you if a variable is undefined, which is great. Again, if you're making changes to someone else's code, it's highly likely that it's the latter, right? That you could end up with an undefined variable somewhere or trying to use a variable before it's defined. And the IDEs will actually flag that, which is super helpful. It's super helpful for debugging other people's code that you're not familiar with. And let's be frank, it's super helpful for debugging your own code as well. So that was great. And that's built right in. And there's lots of ways you can configure it. But it'll basically tell you when you hover over the variable where, the state of its usage. The other thing that is super, super helpful, especially in other people's code, is being able to click or keyboard shortcut to get to the, if you're on a function or an object reference, get to the implementation and the declaration in two different, scenarios, right? That's great because you don't understand the whole flow. You don't know where that function's defined. You don't know where that function's used. And PyCharm makes it really easy to, again, whether you're over function or some kind of object reference or whatever, jump to implementation or declaration, which was just super helpful in navigating, especially 8,000 lines of code inside of an application. The other thing that was good in PyCharm that I liked was global search, right? If I'm going to make a change to a variable or a function, I want to see all of the references in one screen to that variable or function or whatever piece of code you're looking at and looking to change. So I use it's like Command-Shift-F, I think. Yeah, Command-Shift-F will search all of your project files for a particular string. There's lots of options for that search, and then it lists all the instances across multiple files. That's super helpful to go, I changed something, and I just want to visually inspect what other pieces of code might be impacted when I do that. So that's been super helpful. And then the last thing inside of PyCharm specifically that I like is inspection. And so there's lots of linting tools for all types of different languages that you can get in all types of different IDEs. I'm actually using the one built into PyCharm. And this tells you about any kind of warnings or errors across your entire code base. So this is nice, before I'm ready to do a push, either into staging or production, I'll run the inspection plugin and see what I might have missed, right? Is there an error that I just didn't see when I was reviewing the code? And it tells you about all those errors and warnings, which is just super, super helpful. It shouldn't be, a crutch. You shouldn't be like, oh, well, inspection will just tag that, because it's not perfect either. You have to, sometimes double check that, it's an undefined variable or whatever the inspection is. But that was super helpful.
So,
go ahead,
question
Lee.
for you. So one of the things I remember when learning a new language that vexed me was understanding variable scoping, what the context is and what it can change. Does your IDE give you any help with, you're changing a global or it's a local? Because I certainly got that wrong enough times.
Yeah, it'll actually flag that as an undefined variable, right? If it falls out of scope somewhere, or you're referencing, what I love to is if you reference an attribute of an object or a method within an object that isn't defined in the object, it tells you about that. It highlights it, and it's like, this attribute doesn't exist in that object, dummy. I'm like, oh yeah.
Yes.
commented that out, or I actually found errors in there that weren't getting hit in the code all the time that we just didn't realize before. So it'll definitely flag those later.
Wait, are you saying that you don't just make everything a global variable?
It depends on what I'm writing writing code for. In my quick scripts for pen testing or security tasks, absolutely, right? Like I'll just use the global variables. I'm really kind of toying with the quick script versus the really big application, right? And kind of that progression. But yeah, I totally get it. If you're trying to get something done fast, right? Global variables are awesome.
Yeah.
Have you ever had the IDE crash on you, and does it do like auto saving? Because VI has never crashed on me.
Yeah, it has crashed a couple times, not too often, and it does save the state. Yeah, and your configuration as well, which is nice because I've done a lot more configuring in the interface. For example, I've got all my database connections, Docker, and the unit tester debugger like all configured in the interface, and my Python interpreter, which is nice. Again, I really believe you need to do all that stuff manually first to understand how it works, because as April's saying, when it does crash or something goes wrong, you can't troubleshoot it if you've only tried to configure it in the interface, right? So I've done all those things like SQL commands by hand and all that stuff. I made sure I understood it, and then I configured in the interface, and it does save all that config and your code automatically, which is nice. The other thing I noticed was logging in exceptions. And definitely spend some time adding some additional debugging and or logging statements in there. And this is going to be language dependent. In Python, I definitely recommend you look at the logging class and logging methods. The objects, they're awesome. They're awesome. And what I find is developers either, it's one of two things. They'll go to extremes. There won't be any logging or exception handling, or there'll be like way too much, right? And I think it's an art as well as a science, right, as to how much of that you want to put in your code. But I also feel like if the previous developer had a good handle on it, or they were just copying and pasting from Stack Overflow, there's not a whole lot of comments and logging that they're including in that code. And so, putting that stuff in can give you some great indications of how the application's actually working. And again, that might not be there when you inherit the code, because we've all done it, right? You don't put a lot of comments or logging in code that you're like, yeah, this is just working. I know how it works, until you got to revisit it a couple of weeks later, and then you forget how it works. It's the same thing with other people's code. So that was really super helpful. And again, Python's logging class, and I love Python's exception handling. I had to go watch a module on Pluralsight on exception handling to fully understand how it works at a certain juncture. The basics are fine, but when you get into functions calling functions and passing exceptions, you got to read the docs. And that kind of brings me to the next point, which is don't trust logs or comments. One thing I've run into pretty frequently recently is the previous developers, in whether the code has changed or whether they didn't truly understand what it was doing in the first place, they'll write comments or write to logs that something's happening, and then you go review the code and you're like, no, like something completely different is happening. Like that's not what's happening. So they're logging an event incorrectly. So don't trust those logs or comments, right? Especially if you're troubleshooting a bug or some type of issue. Your logging may be saying, hey, that was successful, but don't trust that, is my advice, because that could be a bug or a misinterpretation by the previous developer. So trying to understand what that particular piece of code is doing rather than just trusting the comments or logging statements. As a lot of times comments get stale. You comment something, this code does this, and then there's an emergency bug fix you got to put in, and you change the code. It does something different, but you don't update your comment. My other note on comments is most developers, I won't say a lot of developers in general, can make the mistake of not writing useful comments, right? Like there's a good way and a bad way to write comments. Comments should be very descriptive as to what the code's actually accomplishing. It's hard to like summarize that in a couple of sentences. I learned a lot of those kind of coding techniques from a book called Code Complete. It's actually from Microsoft Press, as well as, my fellow developers that I was working with at the time. Early on were really hard on me, and I'm glad they were, about my comments, right? I remember specifically Joseph, awesome developer. He's like, dude, that comment sucks. Like, it would be very direct about it too. And I'm like, but I understand why. And he'd spend a lot of time explaining to me how, important that was and how to write a good comment. So I feel like that's not just important for if someone else is going to inherit your code, but it's important for you as well, because you might write a script for anything and then have to revisit it months later and forget what it does. So it can save you some time.
Seems like a good idea if you do inherit some code while you're going through it and figuring things out that you create your own comments.
Absolutely. It's a great point, April. And what I like about the IDE as well is that if you put a comment in and you put the keyword to do in all caps, it actually can save those into a separate part of the interface. And you can review all of your to-dos. So a lot of places in the code, I'm like, I don't understand what this code's doing, right? Like, I have no idea. Like, will it ever reach this point in code? All these things, and I'll put a to-do in so that myself or other developers can go in and review those to-dos. Also, if you add to-dos in the IDE, when you make your commit, it'll say, hey, you've got 3 to-dos. Do you want to address those first before you make your commit? So that's super helpful as well.
So while you're making those comments, are you also adding debugging statements to say, I'm here, the value of Bob is 7 or whatever, just to kind of that you can turn on and off in the future?
It's a great point too, Lee. Yeah, I've been modifying the debugging and logging statements to be a little more descriptive about like which piece of the code that I'm in. I found that a lot of the messages were generic, like, hey, there was an error, and here's the exception argument for that error and the traceback. And I'm like, that's great. That does tell you what line of code, but I like the initial error to say, hey, there's an error in this function while I was doing this kind of thing, and being more descriptive in there is important too. Beware of spelling mistakes is my other thing. I mean, I'm not the world's best speller or grammar either, but inside of your code, that's super important. And I've noticed spelling mistakes that not just in comments, but inside of code, and inside of code that traverses multiple functions and multiple files as well. And that can really, I've spent, on one particular spelling mistake, 45 minutes to an hour trying to troubleshoot something. It's because I was spelling it correctly, but the code spelled it wrong. And so those are tricky to deal with. So the IDE, the PyCharm, right, has a spell checker built in, which is great. And you should just make sure everything is spelled correctly. And when you're writing code, every space obviously matters, right? Every indentation in Python, for example, matters. Every single character matters when you're programming. So you should pay attention to things like spelling. Super important. You can go search and replace it too. But obviously you could introduce a bug or some kind of functional issue if you do that, and which makes it really hard for the next person to pick up and start maintaining your code. Which brings me to my last point, which is unit testing, which is huge. Now, I always thought of unit testing as I write my code and then I run the application as the developer and I'm testing it, right? And now, and I'm sure this existed before, right? But in a lot of different languages, Python is an example, there's a module called unit test. You can write your unit test. And this is all leading into Agile, right? And I had never like done that before, and I'm really all about the unit testing your code, and all about the Agile method of writing the test first and then writing your code, and your code will likely be working once your unit tests are passed. And this is all implemented in code. There's lots of examples on the web and lots of modules and helpers inside of your language that can basically help you unit test your code. So I go in and I create all my objects in a separate script. What I liked about the IDE was if you write a script, so I wrote a test script, right? I went into my IDE and I said, that's my unit test script. And then I can run it through the IDE after I ran it from the command line and interpreted the results. I ran it in the IDE, and it gave me this great printout. And it was like, okay, I'm executing this check. And if it passed, it put a check mark. If it failed, it put an X. And then you go into the interface, and for a test that failed, you can double click, jump right to that piece of code. So that was super helpful. Especially, I found my own bugs. Not gonna lie, found my own bugs. Right. I also found a lot of other bugs too, and it helped me kind of unravel some of the code that was there just by writing these unit tests. If you're especially in a larger application, I highly recommend the agile method of writing these tests. It makes your code so much better, so much cleaner when you do it that way. So fun stuff.
So sounds like you might have a new library of requirements when somebody's creating code for you of what's left behind, like unit testing scripts and that you've spell checked the darn thing. Yep. Or do you have such a list?
Not necessarily a list, but certainly I like the requirement of writing those tests and then measuring the coverage, which is something else that's built into most of these tools. Is when I write my unit tests, Python has like the coverage module, which will tell you, your tests are covering 30% of your code base, right? So I know that when I'm doing my unit test that I'm missing out on a lot of functionality. So you go write more tests to try and increase your coverage that exists in Java in a ton of other languages as well. And that's super important. So I could see guidelines and procedures like you're saying, Lee, of making sure your tests cover a certain percentage of functionality when you're unit testing.
That seems like a great artifact to include with code that somebody else may end up with one day as well.
Yeah, because if you go in and make, what I like now is, the reason I implemented it is because I wanted to go in and make changes and add functionality. And I was really concerned about breaking core functionality. If your unit test can test that core functionality, I make my change, like you're saying, April, I go run my unit tests and realize I broke something and can fix it a lot more easily. So, and then I got to implement security testing, right? that's next. I got a lot of the functional stuff done. So hopefully there'll be some further segments on how to do security. In a lot of that, really, what I noticed in a lot of people's applications, right? What we noticed is, and even pen testers tell us, going through Git repositories, that credentials are a huge thing. I think that's like the number one thing that you need to address as a developer or inside of software, is how you're storing and handling all of your credentials. Because you're going to need a lot of them, right? I mean, especially in DevOps, because all of those tools have to chain together. So you got your database credentials, you got your API keys, you've got your user credentials for people using your application. Those, thankfully, in the application I'm working with, are handled correctly. So they are stored correctly in the database using a good hashed algorithm for that. But the other passwords, I mean, really what it comes down to is you need a vault. And people that do development for a living, even they'll tell you, they're like, it's not like the easiest thing in the world to implement. You need one, but it takes a little time. So is definitely on my list to address soon and share with our audience as well. As you see a lot of code with those credentials laying around in plain text. Any other questions, comments? Alrighty. April?
It just sounds like there's some neat features in that sort of setup. I don't do a lot of coding anymore, but if I did, I'd definitely check it out.
Yeah, I'm really liking the PyCharm. It was a good recommendation.
And I'm thinking that what you've got out here would be a real leg up if next time I was starting to wade through somebody else's code to understand it and then alter it without breaking it. You have to see how successful I am. That's
the trick, is to not break it.
I'm wondering what kind of automation you can put around that for like doing code scanning before you check it in, or or something like that. I was looking at their website, and it looks like that you can write your own plugins and things. I wonder if there's anything that can do that already.
Yeah, there's tons of plugins that are out there already. Some come from JetBrains, is the company, and there's others from the community as well. They give you a little more advanced features, likely some that can do a lot of that automation. I haven't really automated my workflow. I've made it easy for myself, but I haven't like fully automated, the kind of linting functionality and code checking, in the process. So I'm sure all that's available.
Well, we got to practice what we preach, right?
That's right.
We tell everybody else to automate because it makes it, it makes it happen. First of all, you don't forget, and then you don't really have to think about it.
Yeah. I love the DevOps for the capability to do that automation, right? So what I'm progressing towards is, as I make changes, as I make security improvements, that there's tests that automatically run when you push the build that check against that. And most modern, software shops are already doing this in various levels, obviously. But I think there's a difference between, functional testing and security testing as well, right? And even different levels of functional testing, right? I think unit testing is very different because unit testing, it lives inside the code. What I thought was really cool is like, oh, I can just like write a test script and I'm inheriting all the objects from my code. I can go create everything, and that's a great unit test. Once it pushes up to the next level, right, you're pushing it into one of your staging environments. Then you test automatically through the web interface, right? Because that's introducing a whole lot more code and kind of code flows into your environment, right, and your testing. And then security testing, I think, is a kind of a separate thing that runs against that. And all the tools you can string together to do that in an automated fashion, which is all. And a lot of people are doing that. And if you're not, it's certainly something you want to look into, depending on which environment you are is going to define your tools. So
it's sort of like micro DevOps.
Yes.
When it's you and your code.
Exactly. Cool. So with that, we will take a short break, come back, talk about the enterprise security news.